It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the techniques that we are using when we observe congenital anomalies in the prenatal stage. So we've been looking at chromosomes now, believe it or not, for about 50 years. We've been doing it primarily by chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis. And one of the primary reasons that we often evoke or ask to do prenatal testing is when we see a congenital anomaly. Because with many of the trisomies or the common trisomies, we do see some characteristic anomalies, primarily involving the heart, the kidney, and then we see a lot of softer markers that we see like the abnormal nuchals, echogenic bowel, choroid plexus cyst, and omphalocele, etc. And that often leads to the request to do prenatal invasive testing. So if you ask what the incidence and spectrum of karyotype abnormalities in prenatal diagnosis, I'm often amazed that you very often seem to get just like one lump sum. Like overall, about 89% of prenatal diagnoses have a normal karyotype and 11% have an abnormal karyotype. But what I'll show you is that figure really changes depending on the question that you ask. So we do see an abnormal karyotype in about 29% of prenatals, and this is if you combine CVS and amnio, that are referred for ultrasound abnormalities, and that contrasts about 4.9% of prenatals that are referred for all other indications. So we definitely see this temporal variability by indication and the timing. So if we break that down even further and you ask the question at the time of CVS, we know that almost half of referrals with an ultrasound anomaly will have an abnormal karyotype. The other half will be normal. And that drops quite considerably down to about 17% at the time of amniocentesis and 83% normal. Then we see for all other indications, primarily age or abnormal screen, about 6% of them being abnormal at CVS and dropping by 50% to about 3% at the time of amniocentesis. And then again, you see everything all totaled up, which I think is not really that useful. I think it's a lot more useful when you specifically zone in at the time and with reference to the specific indication. Again, a further breakdown, and the primary reason for the slide is just to show you the common aneuploidies that the usual cast of characters that we talk about. Down syndrome, trisomy 21, you can see one of the highest, diagnostic yields in ultrasound anomalies, and even so for all other indications, again dropping at the time of amniocentesis for ultrasound anomalies and all other indications. But again, you see trisomy 18, trisomy 13, monosomy X, and again, you see that attrition at the time of amniocentesis. And so we know that trisomies 13, 18, 21, and Turner's monosomy X are the most common aneuploidies related to maternal age or fetal abnormality. Since routine chromosome analysis takes about 7 to 10 days to culture cells and look at the karyotype, there is still, even in today's age with new next generation sequencing and microarrays, which I'll talk about for the rest of the lecture, there is still a utility to get a rapid result, particularly when you see these abnormalities on ultrasound. And this is done depending on where you are in the world. In the United States, we primarily do it by FISH. And I know in the rest of the world, there is FISH, but MLPA or qPCR is a very, very well-utilized tool to get a rapid result. Technically, some of these things you could get back in a couple of hours. Practically, you normally get them back within 24 to 48 hours. But the ability to do this rapid screen does reduce emotional burden on the patient and or the physician when you are dealing with an increased risk of a chromosome abnormality following an abnormal screening result or following the discovery of a fetal anomaly by ultrasound. So it is an opportunity to reduce anxiety through earlier decision making. That just leaves us with the question that if you do FISH or karyotype and it's normal, what proportion of fetuses with a normal karyotype will still have a genomic abnormality? And this is what we've been doing, as I said, for many, many years, karyotyping, but it has a limited resolution. And typically we describe that in about 5 to 10 million base pairs or greater. With the advent of microarray analysis, and the purpose of this talk is not really to go into the technology, but really to talk about the clinical utility. And essentially, microarrays, or CMA, gives us anywhere between 1,000 to 5,000 times the order of diagnostic magnitude. Really depends on the type of array that you're using and how many probes. From a clinical perspective, it generally gives you about 100 times diagnostic magnitude increase. And we did address the utility of chromosomal microarrays in the prenatal phase, and this was a very large multi-center trial that was done in the United States, led by us at Columbia, but with fantastic clinical and laboratory partners throughout the country. And the main finding that we saw from the NICHD trial was very surprising, in that 1 in 60 indications or referrals for advanced maternal age or positive screen, which is about 1.7%. 1.7% of those referrals had a clinically significant copy number change. And now we're talking about a chromosomal gain or loss that is too small to be seen by karyotyping. So you really need the new technology to see that. And if you think about that, that collectively is higher than the average risk for Down syndrome. When you change the scope and you look at ultrasound abnormalities, we see that about 1 in 17, or about 6%, of those referrals will have a clinically significant copy number change. And more importantly, with the world focusing a lot on NIPT, screening for Down syndrome, we know that it's not all about Down syndrome. We see so many other things very similar to what we see in our postnatal studies that shows about a 15 to 20% yield in children with unexplained developmental delay and intellectual disability. And some of the classic examples you'll see here: Melodica, Prader-Willi, Wolff-Hirschhorn, but we also see these microdeletions or microduplications that are non-syndromic and are associated with intellectual disability and autism. So when we see a structural abnormality, particularly a cardiac defect, in the past, it would be a very strong reason to initiate FISH studies looking for velocardiofacial DeGeorge syndrome, because we know about 75% of cases with the 22q11.2 deletion have cardiac defects. And that was one of the most common referrals that we used to see, particularly if you saw, let's say, a conotruncal defect. However, we know that cardiac defects are not only associated with 22q deletions, there are many others. And if you have a fetus that has a microdeletion syndrome and you restrict your analysis to FISH for DeGeorge, you will only pick up about 1/3 of cases. 67% of cases with all cardiac defects will not be detected by FISH, and if it's isolated, that's about 63%. Primary reason is that there are significant microdeletions that are associated with cardiac defects, and he has just a whole host of them. But typically, it's not uncommon to see chromosomal imbalance associated with congenital anomalies. So that is really not a surprising finding. So there was some really good work done by Jennifer Donnelly, who at that time was a fellow at Columbia and is now attending in Ireland. And she basically took the NICH data and she said, well, can we further stratify this by organ system? And the first thing that should jump out is that when you see a single system abnormality, the risk or the additional benefit from microarray is a lot lower than when there are multiple systems involved. And there you can see the difference, with an overall of about 8.1%. But what Jennifer did then is further stratify this by anomaly system. And for any of you who are interested, this was published in Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2014. And it's a really nice way of further stratifying and looking at the risk, again, based on the anomaly that you see. Importantly, we did learn lessons from microarray. Many new microdeletion or duplication syndromes have no or subtle ultrasound findings. And this was a case that had an isolated clubfoot. that was enrolled in the microarray study for nothing other than a clubfoot, which in most cases is just isolated and not associated with anomalies or genetic defects. But it just so happened that we found a 1.39 megabase gain on chromosome 7q. I'll tell you that at the time that this happened, we had never seen this before, and really fortunately for us, around about that exact same time, there was a large publication that came out describing this new 7q11.23 microdeletion syndrome. So for at least the timing for us worked out pretty well, and we could have some good definitive evidence-based information that we could pass on to the patient. So as I said, we do see microdeletions that are associated in neurocognitive deficits, and that occurred in just under 1% of cases. And importantly, these are cases that were referred for advanced maternal age or a positive screen. And here you can see, again, a whole list of these. And more importantly, they echo very much what we see in postnatal studies with intellectual disability, autism, schizophrenia, etc. And so after this, and again, there were a couple of other studies, large-scale studies that were done around about the same time, it was no surprise that there was a consensus statement coming out from the ACOG and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine that all pregnant women should be offered at least the option of diagnostic testing, irrespective of maternal age. And it also recommended that microarray replace or at least supplement karyotype for prenatal evaluation of fetuses with major structural anomalies. And so if we look at the breakdown and we see, okay, microarrays pick up some but not all, what are we seeing? Here you see the incidence that we're picking up in terms of the slice of the pie. We saw the 1.7% for each of AMA and positive screen. And then we look at ultrasound anomalies and we see that that accounts for about 6%. But what you see is a large section missing. And what's happening is we starting to fill in the pie in terms of the diagnostic yield by turning and looking at sequence variation. And this is either going to be done by exonic, which is primarily most of the studies. I'm going to give you some of our data, and then Lynn Chitty is going to talk about the UK experience right after me. And so what can I tell you about the studies that have been done on whole exome sequencing to date? What you'll see is that most cases that have been reported are based on whole exome sequencing, so not looking at the whole genome, but really targeting the exons. They've been postnatal and selected, and that's why you'll see such a wide range of diagnostic yields. There's only been small series that have been published in the prenatal stage, fortunately, both the US and the UK experience, which you'll hear from myself and Lynn Chitty, is going to be published shortly. So there was a really nice meta-analysis done by BEST in prenatal diagnosis last year. Again, you see this wide range, 6 to 80% diagnostic rates across the 16 studies. That's because most of them were not selected. They were kind of picking the juiciest, most exciting anomalies, which, as you know, will more than likely have a higher diagnostic yield. They were mainly done on whole exome sequencing, and less than 50% of them looked at the proband and the parents, looked at trios. And there were 2 large cohorts of unselected fetuses, one coming from Colombia. And the point of this bullet is just to show you, just like in microarrays, when you looked at isolated anomalies versus multiple anomalies, you do see differences in diagnostic yield. And in these 2 small unselected studies, it was around about 3.6 or 3.6 to 6.2%, and much higher for multiple anomalies. So here is the breakdown of what we're doing at Columbia. We are doing a non-selection, or an ongoing study with all patients with fetal structural anomalies, so we're not picking and choosing. It does include nucleus of greater than 3.5. We get informed consent. We do get parental blood. So it's essential that we do trio analysis, we do karyotyping and microarray, and trio whole exome sequencing. Any clinically significant exonic or variant that we find is then reported back after confirmation in our clinical laboratory. So this is more or less to date. Actually, it's probably about 2 or 3 months old, but the proportions haven't really changed. And we've screened probably now closer to about 14 or 1,500. There's a number that get withdrawn for various reasons. We do see the normal yield of abnormal karyotype or microarrays. That left us with about 660 eligible for sequencing. We got 65% consent rate, a couple dropout because of poor sequencing, and we have a whole bunch ongoing. So what I'm going to report on is 364 trios. So out of the 364 trios, you can see our hit rate is around just under 14%. So we had 50 out of 364 with what we called a pathogenic or disease-causing mutation or variant. 27 out of the 50 were de novo dominant, 5 being inherited. Recessive inheritance accounted for about 28% or 14 cases, and then X-linked recessive, 1 de novo and 3 inherited. We had 4 incidental findings. And what I can tell you is that if we look at our hit rate over time, it's kind of jumped up from 7.8% to 13.7% over time. You could ask what are possible reasons for that. One explanation could be that our early series was too small. But most importantly, we see this ever-expanding knowledge of prenatal phenotypes. And this is very important, and I think you'll see this from my talk and from Lynn Chitty's talk. As we get new information, it helps us to reclassify some variants. What's happening in the interim is this new medical literature that's now associating candidate genes with human disease, and I'll show you some examples. And then follow-up postnatally allows us to identify children growing into a phenotype. And that's a very important point because the phenotype we see in the prenatal setting is often not what we see later on. And I've got some examples, and I think Lynn's got some examples. So just like in microarrays, you see this difference between whether there's a single anomaly versus multiple anomalies. They see 7.6% versus about 27%. For single anomalies, specific organ systems are likely to have high diagnostic yields. And again, if we break it down by organ system, this does include cases with multiple anomalies that were counted more than once. So this shows just some of the well-known genes and disorders that we saw. For example, JAG1 in Alagille. You can also see, you can also see MEC2 in Rett syndrome. But we do see quite a large proportion of fetuses that have Noonan spectrum disorders or mutations associated with them, and some of the classic ones being KRAS and SOS1. What are some of the lessons that we've learned to date? Number one, a genetic diagnosis can provide reassurance. And this was a case, going back of polydactyly. Here you can see abnormal left and right foot. And what we have is a very large differential diagnosis, some of which are quite nasty and quite clinically significant. And so the question is, what are we dealing with? And so we did, this patient was enrolled, and we did whole exome sequencing. We saw a mutation in the sonic hedgehog gene. Mutations in SHH are known to cause limb malformations. And in this case, it was consistent with a clinical diagnosis of triphalangeal thumb with polysyndactyly. What was important for the parents was that this diagnosis typically has no associated cognitive problems, and they usually do pretty well with surgery. So of all the things on that differential, this was one of the better things to come up with. And there you just kind of see at birth the nice matchup from the ultrasound findings. Case 2, sequencing analysis reveals incidental findings that in some case may have medical importance. This was a cardiac defect. We did not actually see a pathogenic or suspicious sequence variant that could give us a reason for the cardiac defect, but we did find an incidental finding of a factor 11 deficiency. And you could argue that if this kid is going to end up having surgery, knowing about clotting factors would be an important thing before you started cutting open for surgery. And the last example the importance of reanalysis, and this is very critical. And so we had a patient with vermian hyperplasia and a genesis of the corpus callosum, IUGR less than 3% percentile. It had a normal array, normal karyotype, European descent. The patient did elect to terminate the pregnancy just based on ultrasound findings. And we found a de novo non-synonymous missense mutation in RAC1. And this was flagged by our bioinformatics team because there was no human disease reported in OMIM at that particular time. We do know that RAC1 has an important role in neurite outgrowth and axonal pathfinding as well as neuronal migration, and our variant wasn't present in EXACT. And so we put it on Gene Matcher, and PubMed alert was set for new publications. And then about a year later, there was a publication with 7 individuals with de novo missense RAC1 mutations and variable developmental delay with additional features. Our variant was not included in the publication. And so now we have a phenotypic overlap, we have an inheritance match, we have a disease mechanism and an OMIM gene, and that prompted us to confirm and report to the family. When the patient was called, she was already 8 months pregnant. She had already, because of her prior pregnancy, had a fetal MRI and ultrasound due to concerns from her prior pregnancy, and she was relieved for the low recurrence risk. Despite that, she was still preparing to test her son, who was already born, for the remote possibility of germline mosaicism. So the importance of reanalysis, particularly when there are new publications, and I'll talk about this case where the child grew into the phenotype. So the RERE gene is associated with developmental delay and intellectual disability and defects involving the brain, eye, ear, heart, and kidney. The presentation was just a nuchal of 3.5 millimeters. So there was nothing there really to be seen. Postnatal presentation had hypertonia dysmorphic, was dysmorphic and hearing loss, and did match the features associated with RERE mutations. So the last 2 things I'm going to show you, and since the title of this meeting is called Controversies in Genetics, I'm going to bring up 2 issues. And so what we did is we looked at 7 different labs that offer expanded carrier screening, and you can see the number of genes, lab 1 with 141 all the way up to 992. And we said, if our patients had undergone screening at any of these labs, what proportion of abnormalities would have been detected? And the bottom line is that commercial expanded carrier screening still misses the majority of conditions found in the structural anomaly cohort, and this raises the debate as to whether we should be further expanding carrier screening to the whole genome or exome level. We also said there is one particular lab that does NIPT, looking for de novo mutations, and we said, okay, if they had done NIPT, how many of our de novo cases would they have picked up? And they would have picked up about 6 out of the 20 de novo cases. So they still miss the majority of conditions found in structural anomaly cohort. And again, a debate as to whether this is a case for further expanding cell-free DNA screening models to larger gene panels or whole exome level. What would the advantages be? Well, cell-free fetal DNA screening for de novo variants could be done in the first trimester, leading to earlier diagnosis, discussions of options and pregnancy management and planning. Expanded carrier screening could be done even in preconception, allowing more couples the option for IVF with PGD and/or earlier diagnostic procedures. What are the barriers? Scalability. You certainly require more infrastructure to process and curate large number of samples. Costs. What is the cost of screening in relation to the economic benefit to need to access, in healthcare dollars? That's going to be different in different countries. And curation. In the absence of a phenotype, some variants may be classified as insignificant and not reported to patients, and many labs do not currently report variants of unknown significance to decrease confusion and anxiety. So if we put this all together and we say, what do we get from each technology? Currently, I showed you the karyotype, which accounts for about 17% of fetal anomalies in the second trimester. Going submicroscopic, looking further, a microarray is going to add on an additional 6%, remembering that microarray is going to pick up most of those karyotype abnormalities. So this is the additive value. Then going down to the sequence level, and just from our data, we're getting about 14% hit rate. And so it still leaves a large slice of the pie, and there's still new technologies coming down the pike that hopefully will uncover some of those. So approximately 13.7% of our unselected structurally abnormal pregnancies with a normal karyotype and array will have a causative mutation. As I showed you, the diagnostic yield may be as high as 80% when you're picking and choosing. It's important, we believe, to do trios. That gives us the highest diagnostic yield and confidence. Approximately 20 to 30% more have plausible mutations. I didn't really talk about this a lot, but these are the ones that we put on our watch list. These are ones where there's not enough evidence, and we feel that many of these, as evidence starts to accumulate, that will actually land up being pathogenic and will probably swing that pie chart to being a much higher diagnostic yield. In certain labs, results can be available in 2 to 3 weeks. There you see kind of the overall 17%, 6% from CNVs, pathogenic. These were those plausible ones, and that's why I think it's going to go down. So, you know, as we do this in a research model, people ask why, you know, what's it going to take to really put this into a clinical model? Logistical reasons, there's high costs, transitioning research and developmental protocols into standard clinical laboratory protocols. You require much higher throughput, different equipment. Clinical reasons, its relevance to public health, the significance of new finding, particularly when there's a lack of supporting literature, and financial reasons. Who's going to pay for this? And again, this is going to differ really depending on which country you're at. So if next generation sequencing is to be a standalone test, it will at minimum require detection of aneuploidies, partial aneuploidies, and then micro-deletions and micro-dels. If you're going to do just a one test, you have to at least be as good as all the other things in that pie chart. So, in conclusion, next-generation sequencing is a powerful tool that has the ability to reveal the basic building blocks of a person's being. In a research setting, it is uncovering a great deal of knowledge regarding the etiology of common, rare, and complex genetic diseases, but there is still a formidable amount of knowledge that is lacking regarding the consequences of rare variants. Clinical utility will certainly improve as this knowledge gap closes, and we're creating a database. We're working with multiple others. I think there's a UK effort, and as this database builds, so we'll get better and better. We need to take the lessons we have learned and still learning from microarray and apply them to next generation, single nucleotide variant calling, ask the right questions, and do the necessary validations. So I'll acknowledge everyone at Columbia in the IGM, our PGM, and our MFM. And if there's time, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.